Hello there, everyone. Welcome to our first JSFP live call. I'm Mark McKergow, and I'm the editor-in-chief of the Journal of Solution Focused Practices. And this is the first in our occasional series of calls where we get to discuss a paper that's been published in the journal with the author or the authors. And I'm very, very excited that David Blowers has joined us today. He is based in the UK, and he'll tell you a bit more about himself in a moment. But he's written this very, very interesting paper called "What Difference Will That Make? Contracting More Collaboratively with Solution-Focused Brief Therapy," where he takes a thing that I think is kind of accepted wisdom in the SF world and just questions it a little. And it's a very well written and very well put together paper, I think. Whatever you think of the content, and I hope we're going to find some ways to talk about that. Okay, now the outline of the call is going to be David is going to summarize his paper. He's not going to present the whole thing because you all ought to have had the chance to read it already, and there'll be a link in the notes underneath the recording if you haven't read it yet. So David's going to summarize his paper for about 10 minutes or so. Then we go into small groups where we can meet some new people, talk about the paper, how it struck us, what we like about it, what questions we have. Then we'll come back together and I will take questions in the chat and we'll engage with David in a conversation about what you think about his paper. And then it's going to take about an hour. That's my goal. And then the recording will be published on the journal's new YouTube channel, and you'll be able to watch it at your leisure. Okay, David, hello, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us. Please, first of all, briefly introduce yourself to everyone.
Well, thanks for having me. So, yeah, I'm David. I'm a solution-focused therapist. I trained originally as a person-centered psychotherapist, and they're both approaches that I use and love and feel at home with. So I'm currently teaching psychotherapy, person-centered psychotherapy for one role, and also working at Oxford Brookes University for a counselling service where we're using solution-focused therapy. So I think maybe some of that background explains the existence of this paper, the kind of lenses that I'm looking through.
Great.
And it's great to see such a global spread of people.
Well, it's one of the nice things about the solution-focused world. It's very, very international.
Yeah.
We may not be the thickest layer of people around the world, but there's a thinly spread, but there are people all over the place who love and use solution-focused practice and continue to develop it. So, well, thanks, David. All right. Well, look, I'm going to hand over to you now. Please give us a summary of your paper, and everyone, please listen up, and then we will get into groups to have a chat about what we think. So, David, over to you.
Okay, so this is a paper which really has a very, very small focus. It really focuses on one small question that repeatedly comes up in solution-focused sessions, and it's a question which is something like, what difference will that make? So, as I'm sure you know, in solution-focused therapy, we co-construct a dialogue with clients, and what we're particularly interested in is their preferred outcome, their hoped for future, what's helping them work towards that. So that's kind of the intent. If we go into a solution-focused therapy session, that's kind of the intent that we have of what the conversation will be about, really. That's what we're asking questions about. And that's really what solution-focused therapists tend to see as their role, to talk about outcomes or what kind of future somebody hopes for. And that's not always, but sometimes that goes more smoothly than other times, let's say. So a lot of the leading solution-focused writers, particularly in introductory books, have talked about what do you do when a client says something like, I want to understand why I have these problems, or I want to get things off my chest, and they're not actually talking about the kind of outcome that they want to have in their life, as Brief put it, but in terms of the kind of therapeutic processes that they'd like to experience. So there's basically a conversational move that I'm calling the difference question. as a shorthand, which is to ask a question, which is something like, so what difference will that make? If you could get it off your chest, if you could understand why you have these problems, what difference will that make? The answer to that will hopefully be something about how their life will be different. And then we can carry on with the sort of business that we came in to do, to ask questions about that outcome or that life or those hopes that people have. And I was reminded when I was thinking about this, Steve DeShazer cited Erickson's comment that therapy is about two people trying to find out what the hell one of them wants. That's a quote that often lives in my mind. So it seems so relevant a lot of the time. And I think there's a funny kind of ironic thing in this, where if a client's saying, I want to get things off my chest or understand why I have these problems, and we're automatically moving the conversation somewhere else. But they've literally told us what they want. And we're deciding to do something different because that's how we work. So then I think about it from the client's point of view. So a new client coming into therapy, I'm thinking particularly of context, and this is probably influenced by the fact that I work in a context like this, where people aren't choosing to have a solution-focused therapist. They're coming in to get some therapy or counselling, and then they're potentially working with a solution-focused therapist. So the way that the general public or the potential new client thinks about therapy is not necessarily how we think about therapy, and I think we're pretty radical and unusual in how we think about therapy. They might have had counselling before, they might have, God forbid, seen on TV in a dramatised way, which is usually wrong anyway, but they might be expecting something broader than a conversation about outcomes. They might be expecting to understand why, get advice, get things off their chest, or many other things. And they might actually want one of those approaches. They might feel that one of those things would actually be quite good for them and how they process things. And they might be aware that many therapeutic approaches work equally well. So it seems legitimate that they might come in with different expectations and particular desires for therapy. So if we hear that and we immediately automatically almost switch to a question which gets them off that topic onto the sort of subject matter that we want, I think there's a couple of risks to that, and that's what I'm exploring in this paper. So I think there's some risks in terms of the therapeutic clinical consequences, and I think there's a bigger question about power and who holds power in that exchange. One problem, I think, with bypassing the client's preferences, which almost goes without saying because it's so obvious, but it's so obvious it's easy to overlook, might be that the client doesn't get the thing that they came to therapy for. So we could feel quite satisfied that if we ask what difference it would make if the client got the processes that they want, and then what happens next leads to that outcome, then that's all good. But I found quite an interesting paper which looked at therapy clients broadly with good outcome scores, but reporting low therapy satisfaction. And there was a particularly interesting case of a CBT client who had several positive behavioural changes. She came in for depression and depressive complaints, it was called in the paper, had a really good outcome, lots of behavioural changes, but came away thinking she would have liked to have found a real cause for the depression and was dissatisfied with the therapy. So the fact that she got the outcome that she might have hoped for didn't satisfy the fact that she didn't get the therapy process that she was asking for. And more positively, we know there's a lot of research around this at the moment because pluralistic therapy is gaining a lot of attention, that shared decision making in therapy increases clients' satisfaction, and it's associated with reductions in dropout, clinical change, and that kind of thing. And it can well be the case that having a conversation about kinds of preferences, even if you're not able to meet them, but showing willing, that's in qualitative research being reported as appreciated by clients. On the point of dropouts, I think in solution-focused therapy, we often quite rightly challenge the idea that dropouts are necessarily bad, because perhaps someone's just getting on with their life and they've got better things to do than see us, and that's good. But it is also the case, on the flip side, that it might be because things have gone badly, and we shouldn't ignore that possibility. So there was some research on clients' moments of disappointment in therapy, and the researcher found that the most common response to feeling disappointed with a therapist was either to leave therapy or think about leaving therapy. And quite often, as a result, if they were to leave therapy, the clients became disinterested in mental health services, or had difficulty finding them. So that seems a risk worth thinking about. If they have an experience that they don't feel satisfied with, and then they go away, we can say, well, maybe we weren't the right therapist for them, or maybe they don't need therapy anymore. But it is possible that they've just been put off therapy and they'll continue living with their difficulties. So I think it's worth considering. And then there's the sort of question about power. I think there's a bit of a question of respect, and I'm not insinuating that any solution-focused therapists are being disrespectful or unethical in how they work. But when I was working in this way, I started to feel a little bit uncomfortable with asking that difference question, because the more I did it, the more I just so easily went with it. It became quite slick, and a lot of time it works, and people just move on to having the outcome-focused discussion that we hope for with the question. But I felt like I was at a real advantage, because some of them had never even been to therapy before, and I'd seen scores of clients and asked them this question and practice this. Essentially, it's a maneuver with a particular end in mind. And I started to feel that was a little bit unseemly, and that's what led me to start thinking about this stuff. I use Julian Proctor, who's a person-centered therapist, wrote a really good book about power in counseling psychotherapy, where she gives some frameworks and models to think about power, which I won't go into in detail now. But essentially, as therapists, as much as we want to have a sort of equality with clients, we have power from sitting in the therapist chair. We have power from practicing this technique of the difference question. If we want the conversation to go in the way that we want, which is to think more about outcomes and hopes and therapy processes, that's a bit of a power move. We're saying our agenda is the important one here that we want to focus on. It's for your own good, but it's our agenda. And it is often the case that people might come to therapy because they've experienced powerlessness in their lives, or oppression, or abuse, or whatever. And for me, there's a bit of a question about the means and the ends with that. For me, and it depends how you consider the ethics and the power relations. For me, and I think coming from a person-centered therapy background where there is a lot of focus on power, for me, I felt uncomfortable with that. I just wanted to acknowledge what the client had said about what kind of process they would like, and find a way to articulate how to do that. And I think there's two therapist attitudes that I'm advocating, really. So one is being committed to trying not to disempower clients, or conversely to encourage their self-efficacy. And another is in having a pluralistic view on therapy, which is to say that we know lots of different therapy approaches work. we might not want to do them all, but it's reasonable for people to have preferences and get the kind of therapy that they might like. So what I'm suggesting in this paper, particularly in contexts where people aren't choosing to have solution-focused therapy, is firstly, even if they're just talking about an outcome and not a process that they would like, just to outline what it is that we do. And that could be as simple as saying something like, in this way of doing therapy, I'll ask you questions about the kind of outcome you would like and what's helping with that already. And does that sound okay to you? And the answer to that is very often yes. For me, that's telling me that it's legitimate for me to go ahead and ask those questions, not just in terms of the kinds of questions I'm asking, but also that it is legitimate for me to lead the conversation. I trained in a method of therapy which is more about trying to understand what the client's telling me. So even the assumption that the therapist asks questions or that the therapist leads the conversation wasn't an assumption that I came into solution-focused therapy with when I started training in it. And if a client does express the sort of therapeutic process they want, I think there's various things we can do about that. So firstly, I would suggest that we acknowledge it. If we think they're talking about what they think should happen in therapy, but they're not actually that bothered, that's something we can always check out with them. And it might be possible that we can accommodate the client and feel willing to accommodate the client. And there are often ways to do that in a broadly solution-focused way. So if they want to talk about the problems that they've got and talk through the problems, this reminds me of the idea of the sort of problem island and a solution island, and not rushing too quickly into solution talk. It might be that we know, okay, let's make sure we don't rush too quickly. It might be that we could integrate approaches from elsewhere if we know them without getting in the way too much. Or it might be that we actually do have different ways of working that we can offer and would like to offer, or it might be that we want to learn another way of working because therapy is quite interesting and it's fun. Or we might not want to do any of those things, but there is the opportunity to potentially accommodate what the client wants. And if we don't want to do those things, I think we can be honest about that. And I think it's really important that we don't work in a way that feels wrong to us. We know that the allegiance effect between a therapist and their way of working improves outcomes, and we want to work in a way which feels okay to us. And we could just quite honestly say that's not the kind of way I work. I appreciate a lot of therapists do work in that way. What I do is more like this. Do you want to give that a go? Or would you like me to sort of help you find a therapist that works in the way that you're talking about? And I think that really is, it's just a small thing in the, it's a small 2-minute perhaps turn in conversational process, which for me just puts everything on a better footing, really. It shows respect, and I think clients can feel that they are being taken seriously and have been heard. It might be not everyone wants to work like that, and they might, for perfectly equally ethical reasons, want to pursue brevity at all costs and just go straight into it. But that's where I'm coming from with it, really, from how I've faced working with this problem myself. Don't know if that was 10 minutes or not.
That's fine, David. Thank you very much. That's very clear. Thank you very much indeed. Right, we're gonna go into small groups now. So welcome back, everybody. I'd be really grateful if you could put your questions and thoughts in the chat, because we've got lots of people and we'll need to find a way to kind of get some questions to David. And so if you want to put your thought or your question in the chat, and then we can perhaps see what David has to say and engage you in the conversation. So just waiting. So there was one question while we're waiting for the other ones. There was one that came from Svea Vanderhorn, in South Africa. She says the language string you wrote about, what difference will that make? And there are other similar things like what difference might that make, or what difference do you hope that might make, or
Mm.
what might that make possible, etc. And I think her question is, would it make a difference if you were sort of to substitute any of those?
Yeah, essentially not to my point, no. So the in the paper I talk about a few variants of it, from Bill O'Connell, Guy Shannon, as well as the one that Brief present, which is what difference will that make? Um, but yeah, for me the point is, and I think it is actually a good question to ask, but I might just ask it a turn later in the conversation if they've talked about having a specific outcome in mind. It feels to me like it's moving them on whatever form it takes to move them on too quickly from that.
Right. So I'm watching the chat eagerly, but nothing has come yet. So if you don't have a question, maybe somebody would like to type something in the chat anyway, just to make sure it's all working. Um, but okay, so I have a question then, David, while we're waiting for other people.
Mm.
So I've always rather liked this element of solution focused practice, this sort of sidestepping. And I've always seen it as sidestepping an invitation into a giant can of worms, where your client has a some sort of idea about something that ought to happen,
Yeah.
and something that ought to happen, and that's not what we're going to do primarily. We're going to do solution focused brief therapy, which is about mostly about descriptions.
Mm.
And so what we're doing is sort of is and in the descriptions live in live, detailed language and other things around specific descriptions of particular situations and experiences and
Mm.
so forth. And so I've always thought that this kind of routing it back to the description would be something like an example of Wittgenstein's breaking away from the superstition of the causal nexus. The client thinks this thing ought to have to happen, but we don't think that. And so in
Yes.
that situation, it's better to avoid the question entirely rather than open a can of worms that may prove very difficult to shut, although it may not
Yeah.
in ways that you point out in the paper.
Yeah.
So that's why I've always kind of rather appreciated this
Yeah.
approach. What do you think?
I can see why you say that. I suppose for me, there's already worms coming out of the can because the client has already said that they want something in particular in terms of a process. Um, so I'd feel like I was just kind of ignoring the fact that there was a worm crawling around if I were to go straight to that. Um, and I think also, as you talk about how we work, I can hear the excitement in which you talk about that, and I think that's contagious. And what I'm talking about is essentially some kind of articulation. So if as a therapist, if I only worked in a solution focused way, and I was able to say, in my view, therapy doesn't need to necessarily involve those processes. The way I work is with this and that, and people find that really helpful quite often. It's really exciting. I'd love to give that a go with you. What do you think? For me, that would be more than enough, but it's just articulating it and having that conversation, I think, for me.
Yeah, okay. Now, Beverly in Canada says, I really appreciate you opening up this issue to not be so rule bound to the disadvantage of the client. Even DeShazer has said sometimes there are better ways. I think that sometimes you can ask the difference question to find out what they're wanting and then go back to their request and have a direction that they're hoping for. Your thoughts about that?
I suppose I would need to understand more what the rationale would be for doing that. I'm open to the.
Bev, if you're there, would you like to unmute and let us know a bit more about what you're thinking?
Um, well, I also felt that what difference it makes is a sidestep. and not always true to the fact that the client has a real thought about what they'd like therapy to go. And so sometimes I found it useful to ask, and if we do have the conversation you're hoping for, about whatever the process or the past or whatever, what are you hoping that what difference it will make for you? And then we can talk about it, and they say, okay, so now let's go back and tell me what you'd like me to know. And then we have, I feel like I'm giving them an option of, let's just take that a little bit further about what you hope this will go to, because sometimes people don't know why they want to get it off their chest. And sometimes it's just really helpful to be able to say out loud, well, if I get it out off my chest, then I'll know one other person knows this. And that's important to me. And then they say, okay, well, let's go there. So that's how I kind of
thank you for explaining that. I'm coming on, sharing the limelight with us. It reminds me of something I heard one of the brief trainers say. I'm not sure who it was, it might have been Evan George, that sometimes for a client to talk about certain things is a relational requirement for the client. We don't necessarily need to hear about the client's past to do what we do, asking solution-focused questions. But it might be that we don't get to ask solution-focused questions unless the client can have the opportunity to do that, because that's what they really want to do with someone that they're having a therapeutic relationship with. And what you say also reminds me of just kind of checking in with the client, particularly at the end of a first session, about how it was, if we've been talking about the right stuff or not. And quite often people are very happy to move to go along with solution-focused questions, but it can be good just to check in on that. Which, what you're saying reminds me of that, just sort of circling back to what they'd said about the processes that they were.
Yeah, I mean, I always feel like I want to be as transparent as possible, so I don't pretend that I'm doing a good job if my client isn't really on side. So getting that kind of feedback is really important to me. So I really liked your paper.
Thank you.
I appreciate you.
Thanks, Bev. Hendrik says, I was reminded of the nymphomania case and how a different explanation allowed the client to move on with less problematic baggage. I wonder if SF has a way to do that. Hendrik, can you unmute yourself, maybe remind us? I think I can remember the nymphomania case, but perhaps not everybody on the call can. So can you give us a little reminder, please?
I'll try. It's been a while, but if I remember correctly, Insu had a client that we might not say nymphomania any longer, but with describing some kind of hypersexuality and a kind of problematic history that led to that. And at some point in the conversation, I think it was Insu who just kind of threw the idea out there that maybe they were looking at it wrong, and maybe it's just a sleeping disorder. And from that point on, it was kind of simpler. And from that point, she would find was able to find ways to deal with that, and lived happily ever after. Something like that. Yeah.
I remember with that case, the client was expecting years and years of really intense psychotherapy, because it must be to do with everything in their past, that they're an nymphomaniac, and it's going to take years to sort out. And then flipping it into them seeing it as it's just insomnia or a sleeping problem. They just felt hopeful that it could be fixed reasonably soon as well. That's another thing about it.
I guess that's about how it's about how the thing is framed, isn't it? Really, it's kind of framing the thing as a question of sleeping, and that reframe seemed to take really well with the people in that case, as far as we read it in the book. Yeah.
This reminds me of the point Guy made, which I mentioned earlier, about checking if a client has a particular therapeutic process in mind, perhaps checking if they feel like it's something that they should have in therapy rather than they particularly want to have in therapy. I think it can be the case that if people see if they're coming in with some sort of distress and they see it as some kind of mental health condition, or there's some sort of rigid label around it, and there's certain ways of doing therapy or treatment associated with that thing, and they can come in and expect that that's what we need. I need years and years of psychotherapy because I'm an nymphomaniac or whatever. Just that's me quoting a client. And it might be that they don't actually want to have years and years of intense psychotherapy talking about their childhood, but they just think that's what you're meant to do. So I think that adds to Guy's point, actually, just checking that out. Is it a preference or it should?
Good point. So we have another question from Susanna Stobart, who's in the UK. What percentage of clients know what therapy involves before they start? She asked. I work with clients who are referred, and I will explain the approach I use and gain consent. They are often pleased with the approach, which the approach would allow for being future focused. They may want to share their reasons for attending, and this allows for coping questions. So I think that Susanna is perhaps, Susanna, I can see you there. If you want to unmute yourself and add to what you wrote, please do. I think she's saying that that something like this seems to fit quite well for her. Susanna.
I think it does. I mean, it has made me think, David. I'm just down the road from you, actually. So,
Right.
I mean, there were other things, but I suppose I put myself in a place where I think I know quite a bit about therapy, but I wouldn't necessarily know. And I think it's people. I don't know how many people actually spend the time researching the exact therapist that they would like before they go to therapy. That was my first question, and so that when you were talking about making assumptions, I think when people go to therapy, I don't know how many therapists will explain their approach before they begin, and I think a client doesn't necessarily know what they want until they've actually received some therapy and whether that fits with them. So
yeah,
and I know that was the caveat of people may not come back because it's not fitted for them, and that's right, that's fine. So I don't know. I mean, I've from personal experience, I've had a number of different approaches that I've received personally, and I think you know quite soon whether it fits with your values or what you're looking for. So
yeah,
I don't know. It was more about the percentage of people, how many people actually know what they want before they go in.
I can't answer that question. But there's an interesting thing about discussing preferences in therapy, in that for some it's their preference not to talk much about their preferences, and there are people that they don't really care how a therapist works necessarily. They might just like the look of someone's profile picture and think they look a bit alternative and they like alternative people, or they'll see anyone, or who cares, just make me feel better, or whatever. So I think part of our sensitivity towards the client's preferences might be just to not talk about it more than they necessarily want to. And what I'm suggesting here is potentially quite a quick discussion, particularly if they're not expressing strong preferences. But yeah, I think it's really varied. Some people have a strong idea, some people have no idea. And I guess we just have to not make any assumptions about that till we meet somebody.
Thank you, David. Thank you, Sarah. Susanna. Anton has a question. It's quite long, so I'm going to invite him to unmute himself and put the point. Anton.
Thank you, Mark. Thanks, David. Really, I appreciate your sensitivity towards what the client wants, and also what the client wants from therapy. I think there's a lot of examples in the solution-focused world of practices of people trying to figure out how to work together with the client and be respectful, and also be very respectful when the client, for example, wants to find a solution to or a cause of why something is happening, that we gently go along and maybe sometimes try to explain how yeah, how it works or how you can look at that. But I just wanted to share something that I learned from Marco Ronzani, and Marco Ronzani is a solution-focused mediator and coach from Switzerland. We invited him a couple of years ago to our training center in Belgium to give a training on solution-focused mediation, and he said, always, we already know that we are not the experts of the client's lives, that we are not the ones to decide what is important for the client. But at least we felt better by claiming that we were the experts of the process. But I hate to tell it to you, he said, we're not even the experts of the process. A process should always be co-constructed with the client. So always, negotiating together with the client in the way you want to approach. But also that also means that if the clients want something that you know that is not working, or that you have to make decisions there. But you mentioned that as well.
Yeah. And if that reminds me of a few points. So one is Brief's 100 SFBT tips and tricks, or what's called. It's not called that, but their introductory book. They talk about what if it feels like, if it seems like a client is not having the change they want. One question we could ask them is if this way of therapy is not necessarily a question we could ask them, but a question we could consider is if this way of therapy is suitable for them. Because most of the time it is, but no modality is infallible with every client. So it reminds me of that. And also, yeah, I think it's true that we can only co-create. We can't be experts in a dialogical process with someone that we haven't met. I mean, that's just hypothetical, isn't it? And then I think that also this reminds me of the question of, we're not the experts in the client's lives, but we are the experts in the process. Sometimes people will say, I think what I'm saying is we're the experts in the solution-focused therapy process, but there are other therapy processes, and a client might have a particular leaning towards one of them. So I think for me, it's a case of we can set out our stall of the process that we are expert in and see if they want to try it or not. But there's many ways to skin a cat.
So there's another question from Ibrahim come at the bottom of the chat. I'm going to come back to Svea's point in a minute, but Ibrahim says, I can't quite see it now at the moment on my screen, but how briefly could we explain SF to clients? And he mentions Paul Grice's conversational maxims of quantity, quality, relevance, and manner. And while you think about that, David, I'm just briefly thinking, there's a session that Chris Iveson did that I analysed a lot years ago, which became known as Jennifer and the Cuddle. And that starts off with Chris, even before he sat down, and asking the client for her best hopes. And she sort of bridles at this a bit and says, go, tell me more about this thing. And he does about 20 seconds on, well, solution-focused brief therapy. It's about looking forward. And if we look back to the past, it's only to collect the useful things. What do you think? And she says, all right, I'll give it a go. And they're off. And it's an extremely interesting and productive session. But I'm sort of realizing that even though Chris is particularly, right at the top end of the let's get on with it spectrum, he in that case responded briefly and sympathetically to this what might be thought of as a legitimate question. Hendrik says, how about I ask questions that open doors? That's a brief thought about it. But something we might all think about maybe. What do you think, David? How briefly could we explain SF to clients?
So I've basically stolen from Guy Shannon's website how he explains it, which is to say that we ask questions about how people would like things to be and what's helping with that already. That's it. That is all I say pretty much.
Okay.
And I think that's pretty brief. I don't think we have to worry too much about wasting the client's time with that. But what I like about it is it's also comprehensive. There's nothing vague about that. It's very much. It does what it says on the tin. That is what I'll be asking about and nothing else. They are the two subjects, and I will be asking about. So I think if they consent to that, they really do know what's coming. And I find that, and this is just anecdotal, but I have found that just saying something like that, I think makes people more willing to answer questions. I think sometimes they're a little bit reticent or awkward about solution-focused questions, but if I've just said that, that can help. And I found that particularly when I've asked questions about interaction. So if I say, what will your housemate notice if you enter the kitchen feeling cheerful tomorrow? Some people find that really, I don't know if that's a British thing potentially, but people find that quite uncomfortable, I find, just talking about other people in that way and not quite knowing why they're being asked. But having just said that much, I found that people are more willing to say something about it. So that was a bit of a side note, but that's how I explain it.
So Sphere, we've got just about a couple of minutes left. Sphere has a point here about public sector services where clients generally do not have choice of modality, as well as when clients access private sector services, benefit from transparency and partnering around how confident the client is. This service and the experience it offers can be bespoke. Sphere, do you want to kind of come on, unmute yourself and say something about that so David can respond, please? If you're still here.
Well, I think it was evoked in the breakout room in here that I think it was evoked, David, by the thing about power, and is it possible to to do something with that? I think context plays a huge role, and I began to think about public sector versus private sector choice and But more importantly, I think for me, this question, I wrote the word bespoke because I was listening and thinking. But I went, how confident are they that this is an encounter in which they are equally valued, relevant, and in fact, probably more so than whoever the practitioner is? Because for me, when that's there, when that element is there, a lot of things dissolve and disappear and change and get enhanced, etc. So I don't think, I think what I'm sort of thinking a lot about is it about the facts of the matter, all this intellectual stuff? It's like this and like that and the next thing, all this conceptual talk. Are we talking more about the encounter that the person has as an experience of, not I will respect you and then you do something which disrespects the client? In other words, people listen to what we say, but they also experience us. So I've begun to think about that. What your paper is evoking for me is, what about the meaning-making experience, not just all these words that we chatter?
Yeah. I think there's a danger in being formulaic potentially, isn't there? If we have sort of stock phrases that we've tended to practice that start getting away with that encounter. And I think your point about how easily can people access other kinds of therapy and what choice do they have and do they have the money? Really important point. Yeah, I think we have to be sensitive to that.
Okay, thank you, Sphere. Thank you, David. We're coming up to the end of the time. So just before we finish, I'd like to excitingly reveal to you that we have a next JSFP live call lined up. It's on the 13th of January. That's Tuesday, the 13th of January. It may say Wednesday in the chat, but it's Tuesday. With Dominic Godat and Elfie Tierney, who will be talking about their paper, SF Leadership Conversations, and a microanalysis of how SF training changes leadership conversations. So that's something to look forward to. You can book using the link in the chat. I will be emailing around everybody who registered for this with links to the recording and the next one. And thank you all for joining us today. And thank you to David, particularly for getting our JSFP live off to such a great start. And we've had a real chance to dig into some quite arcane is the wrong word, but some quite serious stuff here. And I think it's been super. So thank you, David. Thank you, everybody. I'll think about the AI for next time, and we'll hope to see you then. So cheers for now. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.